one, go.
Okay, fantastic. I'll just start again for the sake of the recording as well. So I'm coming along to talk about communities and forest plans today. It's actually, I just went back over the Southern Upland Partnership's forestry position statement this morning, and it actually includes a lot of what I'll talk about today already, and you've obviously done a lot of good work on it. So what I'm hoping is that I can add something to that from the community point of view as well. I've got no background in forestry whatsoever, except for being a community councillor, and having had a lot of woodland applications coming through in the last 2 years, I've kind of had to learn about this from the ground up, as it were. And now I'm part of an organisation called Communities for Diverse Forestry, which tries to have a network of kind of community councils and interested people that can support communities more widely. So why is it important that we're talking about this at the moment? I've put up a screenshot here from the Scottish Forestry clearing statistics, which is where you can find all the information on the grants that have been awarded. I think this is a cumulative total over about 5 years, give or take a little bit. And as you can see from the top line here, this figure of 13,184, that's the amount of hectares of single species conifer grants that have been awarded in our region. And a quick totting up of these figures from the rest of Scotland show that the south takes more of this type of woodland than the rest of Scotland put together. And that trend is set to continue. As you can see, this is pre-submitted woodland creation options for 2022. And we already have 2,500 hectares submitted, as opposed to 0 in 3 of the other conservancies and 650 hectares in Perth and Argyll. You'll know the reasons that we do take more, I'm sure. We're close to the sawmills, there's lots of marginal ground. The climate is deemed likely to be suitable for longer in this area, whereas other areas may start suffering droughts and other problems first. That's just a few of the reasons, that's not an exhaustive list. So what are the opportunities and benefits, I thought, of increased afforestation for people? We should have a look at that first. And I've taken this directly from the UK Forest Standard. And again, I'm sure a lot of you are very much aware of this already, so I'll just skim over this slide, but there's a lot of information on it that people can go back and look at afterwards if they'd like to. So there's public involvement in forestry, can enhance community identity, contribute to cultural values, etc. There are benefits around accessibility, recreation, traditional and cultural uses, education and learning, volunteering, and enterprise development. So there's a whole host of things, you know, and very, very importantly, just general health and well-being, you know, are one of the things that forests offer us. So what are the concerns around this type of kind of concentrated afforestation? What we're seeing locally is that people are worried about the cumulative impacts of so much of one type of forest in some quite densely afforested areas. We have a lot of Sitka plantations already, and we're getting a lot more. Carsfen, for example, had 5 applications, I think, through in the last year and a half. Dalry's had 3 through. This is pushing land prices up very fast, and that's putting land out of reach of locals. We're hearing about loss of leases on houses and grazing land. There's tensions locally because this kind of rapid land use change without meaningful involvement in decision making is difficult for people to understand and process. People have concerns about accessibility, their water supplies, especially when we see multiple forests going along single river catchments. We're starting to see encroachment on really special sites of particular local interest for people, and that can cause problems. But although it's important to stress alongside that taking an out of sight, out of mind approach isn't going to work either in the long run. So, and we do hear those words used on the ground. So that's something to consider. And then the general public are much more educated and aware these days about the wider concerns of afforestation, including protecting our peatlands, the biodiversity impacts, and social and environmental resilience. And that includes, you know, climate change, pest and disease, fire, droughts, windstorms, all the things that forests are vulnerable to. So what's going wrong between the benefits for forestry and what people are concerned about? This is from the community point of view. There's a lack of capacity in community councils, and that's both time and skills. There's apathy. People are feeling very overwhelmed, especially in the area I live in at the moment, because there's a lot of forestry coming, there's a lot of wind farms, and we're just seeing land use change that we don't feel we have much meaningful say in. There's an absolute lack of guidelines for communities to deal with this, and the system is very difficult to navigate. There's confusion over who's involved and how, why, and when we can interact as a community. And as an example of that confusion, you know, a lot of people now wouldn't know the difference between Scottish forestry, Forest and Land Scotland, Scottish woodlands. There's just nothing really that kind of helps people figure out those things on the ground. And those three names I hear getting interchanged on a regular basis, even though they do three very different things. There's a kind of arm's length style to consultation, and from some agents, not all, a reluctance to engage meaningfully. And we're hearing more and more now that the forest management objective is maximum investment return from my client. And this is justified through the need to sequester carbon rapidly. But the kind of gold rush mentality that brings forward doesn't kind of seem to marry very well with just transition principles, which we also hear a lot about. And, you know, the consultations are very much at the information end of the participation ladder, as opposed to the kind of full participation. So what do the rules say? This is also an extract from the UK Forest Standard. And there's a few guidelines here that are for woodland agents and forest managers to follow. And, you know, they're pretty good guidelines. They do consider everything, you know, that we've kind of talked about, but we have the wording that says consider all the way through and aim to, you know, so these words aren't kind of very imperative or mandatory. It's almost as if you can say, yes, well, I did consider that and it didn't fit my management objective, or yeah, we tried that, or we thought about that, but it didn't really work. You know, so there's not a very robust way of making sure this does happen and encouraging it to happen. So I think that's probably a bit of an issue. So they can kind of follow the rule of law of the UKFS, but not necessarily the spirit. And just as an example, this is a typical map that we would be sent as a community council consulting on a forest plan. And you can see there's some colours there and then a kind of rough key, which, you know, to anyone who hasn't spent kind of 18 months trying to work out what it all means, it doesn't really make much sense at all. And we have had proposals come through where we've been sent nothing more than a map like this. And then the woodland agent thought the rest of it was up to the community to deal with in terms of having a consultation. And it must be clear that it wasn't this site, just for anyone who recognises this particular site. But as you can see from the top there, which is another quote from the UK Forest Standard, all of the information is required to be delivered in a form that suits people's likely levels of knowledge and expertise. And that's kind of clearly not happening here. So what can communities contribute in a positive sense to forest design and planning? Because one of the issues at the moment, I think, is that consultation is kind of assumed that it's going to be negative and that there's going to be an objection or a concern, and that will be dealt with or mitigated using the issues log. And so there's not this approach of opportunity when people are talking to communities about what they could contribute to a design or plan. And of course, communities have a strong, very strong sense of place. Often, rich cultural associations, as well as natural heritage. They're often deep-rooted associations that are intergenerational with certain parts of the landscape. They know their places very well in terms of the design input. They know where the important walks are, and that's desire paths, as well as core paths and protected rights of way. They probably have a good idea what species live there, what the habitats are, and what changes there's been to those habitats. And they can, of course, have a really good input into amenity potential and economic ideas that would see more economic engagement on a small scale with woodlands, as opposed to the sort of much larger scale mechanized economic opportunities that we see. So we've been having a look at, what can we do about that collectively. We can empower communities to have a voice and use it proactively. And one of the things we've been doing at Communities for Diverse Forestry is writing the guidelines that guide communities through the whole process of woodland creation, from the scoping through the Scottish Forestry Public Register, right through the whole process, just so people have a simple way of navigating that system. And those guidelines are available for anybody that would like to use them. We think it would be very helpful to have some co-training workshops for communities, industry and NGOs. That's helping industry talk to with communities, not to communities, and vice versa. And communities could do with some training there, and also bringing NGOs and other statutory consultees in there would help, because at the moment all of this information is held in isolation. We don't get to see the habitat surveys very often. We don't get to see what other people's responses are. So we have to formulate our own responses in absolute isolation, just using what we can gather ourselves. We think it would be a good idea to get communities involved in writing local place plans. These could be a really good way of identifying a baseline of quite a lot of this information just across a community council area, so that every consultation doesn't have to be started afresh. And also those local place plans can be lodged with the council to influence local development plans. We'd like to encourage consultations that fully explore sense of place. And I think one mechanism for this would be to try and make sure there's always a site visit. And that could be with the landowner, the woodland agent, and, a handful of people from the community that feel very comfortable and knowledgeable about that landscape. Because so often these are just purely desk-based exercises, and that misses so much of the nuance of how people feel about a place. I think it's important that we dismantle the polarity that exists between communities and the timber industry. There's quite strong feelings at the moment, and I think we need to do some bridge building in that department for sure. We need to resource meaningful participation, and that means, again, it's just time and training, networking. And at Communities for Diverse Forestry, we've also been using social media quite successfully as a kind of campaigning and bridge building tool, just trying to get the conversations out in the open a bit more. Because at the moment, through the formal written consultation and response mechanism, a lot of this stuff stays behind closed doors. And I don't think that's a very fast way to achieving progress. What progress are we seeing? I heard recently that the Scottish Forestry and the Land Commission are working together, and that's around engagement, as far as I know. And we strongly feel that community representatives should have a seat at that table to be able to kind of give some guidance on what would be really useful to communities in terms of how we receive information, how we process it, what the timescales are, etc., etc. We're having direct conversations with Confor, which only started a couple of weeks ago, but there's some very promising noises coming out of that. And we've seen some very positive engagements with local communities on some schemes. I haven't put a huge list of kind of suggestions in, although there are some on the next slide. But what I did want to touch on is that there is so much good work out there already, including your own work, your position statement on forestry. There's also the Timber and Tree Deep Dive from the Welsh Government. There's the Scottish Forestry Stakeholder Report. There's Woodland Nation by Andy Whiteman, all of which have a wealth of good suggestions of how we could go forward sort of hand in hand, people and afforestation. And I suppose the frustrating thing is, I found my way to these reports through talking to a lot of people and spending a huge amount of time on it. But outside of that, it seems to me that a lot of these reports are sitting on shelves and not necessarily finding a way to filter through to action on the ground or available resources for communities. I mean, that's not a criticism, that's just kind of the way things work at the moment. We have a kind of very top-down society. So a few things that I pulled out of those reports are kind of looking at, just ideas of how we could go forward. And one of them that I've been looking at personally is, could we use compensatory planting from wind farms and other developments like the power lines that go through? Could we use that planting where we have to replant those trees that were felled? Instead of going into another Sitka plantation, could we use those trees to really get into the land use debate in real-time pilots on the ground? Because they don't have to go through all the kind of agri schemes or the forestry schemes. Maybe there's an opportunity there to just really explore that. We could be looking at blended ownership or equity and or community benefit options in the same way that we have with wind farms. We've seen some sites recently where they're putting community land aside. The community doesn't get to own it, but there's an area set aside that the community can choose how to use. We think it's really important, as I mentioned before, to include communities at all levels of discussion and decision making. It's no good making all the decisions and then going to tell the communities about it. And we could be supporting mechanisms for local employment and other interests in forests. I've heard recently that there's going to be possibly a resurgence in woodlots, which would be great. There's also woodland crofts, artisan wood products, apprenticeships, all sorts of local economic possibilities. Community woodland offices could be a really useful thing to have. And they could be, they could be advocates for communities, but they could be a lot more than that as well. They could be, rangers, education, engagement. They could cover all sorts of things if the resources were there. And then at the end there, I just put education. Maybe we should have forest schools for everybody. We live in a very heavily afforested area, and there are a few forest schools and some good outdoor education provision, but I would say it's not it's not at a scale that we could see with the amount of forest that we've got already and the amount of forest that's coming. And then I think if we can find ways of influencing policy and importantly empowering communities to be able to respond to consultations, we've got the UK Woodland Assurance Standard review deadline is very soon, so it's a bit of a long shot to include that here. We've got the UKFS in spring 2022, the Dumfries and Galloway Forestry and Biodiversity Strategies up for review imminently, if not already. And the National Planning Framework for consultations just started, I believe. And then, of course, we can keep an eye on local development plans and look at getting far more communities with a local place plan written. And I think on that note, that's quite enough from me. I will leave you with a gratuitous collie and a wood shot and see if anyone's got any questions. I'll just stop sharing.